chemotherapy is a hoax perpetuated by big pharma to make money. They will do whatever they can to protect their investment at the expense of people who suffer. There are a whole host of over-the-counter medications as well as cheap prescription drugs that are very effective against cancer. Who would have thought that ivermectin would prove to be one of the most effective anti-cancer drugs?
Help to support our show and get behind-the-scenes access to conversations like this by joining our community of free thinkers at danastingregory.com/supporter. Have we been getting cancer wrong? Up to 10 million people die every year from cancer, and millions more are living with this disease. But is cancer the disease that we think it is? And more importantly, is there a different way to treat cancer other than chemotherapy with all its harmful side effects? And are big pharma keeping us from discovering viable and less toxic alternatives? To explore this and more, I'm joined by Dr. Paul Marik, who is one of the most published critical care physicians in the entire world. He's authored over 500 peer-reviewed journal articles, including the Cancer Care monograph that we'll be touching upon today. Dr. Marik came to widespread public attention in 2020 when he founded the FLCCC, the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, which was a group of critical care specialists that included recent guest Dr. Pierre Corey, who came together to help prevent and treat COVID-19. However, he's here today to shed light on new research on cancer, research that flies in the face of the medical establishment, to discuss how the use of simple repurposed drugs as well as lifestyle changes can have dramatic impact upon patients' outcomes with far less serious side effects, and why the medical establishment doesn't want you to know about it. Dr. Marik, can we now cure cancer?
Wow, that's a really big question to ask. So if you look historically over the last 50 years, the mortality of cancer has gone up. So despite the trillions of dollars that we've actually spent on preventing cancer, treating cancer, the risk of dying has gone up, and cancer will become the commonest cause of death. However, I think there is a glimmer of hope in the horizon, and not with standard chemotherapy. We know standard chemotherapy is a failed approach. It's based on a false premise, and it can't possibly cure cancer for most patients. But I think there are evolving techniques, evolving approaches that do provide a hope. To be honest, I think the biggest hope is prevention. Cancer is largely a preventable disease, and I think if people were aware of this and did lifestyle changes, they could significantly reduce their risk of getting cancer. And that's probably the biggest impact we can. But in terms of people who have cancer, I think there are glimmers of hope on the horizon, particularly with metabolic therapy, with repurposed drugs, and with immunotherapy. But we haven't got there yet. We're on the way.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to talk about all of these things with you today and come to talk about both repurposed drugs and prevention later on. But you stated that chemotherapy is based on a false premise. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so, when you think of cancer, there are different categories of cancer. And so I'd like to talk about cancers that are chemotherapy curative, cancers that merely prolong life a few months, and cancers that are purely palliative. So there are a few cancers, maybe 5 to 8%, in which chemotherapy actually cures the cancer. And so we're talking about choriocarcinoma, we're talking about testicular cancer, certain leukemias, Hodgkin's lymphoma, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So there are some tumors that actually standard chemotherapy can cure, and also CML. But the vast majority of cancers, so the common cancers: breast cancer, prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer, lung cancer. The performance of chemotherapy is appalling. And at best, it can prolong life 1 or 2 months. And it's based on a false theory. The theory is the somatic mutation theory. So that sounds like a lot. But basically, what the standard chemotherapy or the standard oncology premises, and much to this day, and most oncologists will regurgitate this, is that cancer is due to a mutation in a single chromosomal gene. And then this gives rise to a whole population of cells that have the same genetic mutation, and that this genetic mutation is responsible for the cancer. But there's overwhelming data now to suggest that the somatic mutation theory of cancer is not correct. And so we have to look for an alternative theory. And so there are obviously many different competing theories, but the one that actually seems to hold the most weight and seems to be the most plausible, for which there is credible scientific data, is what's called the metabolic theory of cancer. Now, this doesn't mean to say that genes and genetics don't play a role, but it doesn't seem in most cases to be the predominant cause of cancer.
Wow. I mean, this is a big revelation. For me personally, I never went to medical school, but I did learn in biology about this genetic mutation theory. And I think it seems to be that that's the common accepted, understandable cause for cancer. But this is challenging that view. Why is there a lack of consensus amongst the kind of field of oncology on this basis at this point?
Yeah, so let me read you a quote from Travis Christofferson. So Travis Christofferson wrote a book called Tripping Over the Truth, and he summarizes it really nicely. No researcher can point to any single mutation or combination of mutations and say with confidence that it alone is the cause of cancer. So the problem is, in any one cancer, there are hundreds or thousands of mutations. They're changing, they're not the same. Within the same cancer, there are different mutations. Patients with the same cancer have different mutations. And there's some cancers that don't have mutations. Nor can researchers point to a series of cellular systems rendered dysfunctional by mutations and make the same claims with confidence. So it's just a mess. There are too many mutations. The mutations aren't consistent. They're not consistent within the same tumor. They're not consistent amongst different tumors of the same type. It's just a mess. And so this idea that there's a single mutation and this results in a whole series of daughter cells with the same mutation just doesn't hold weight. The scientific data doesn't support that concept. So even James Watson, obviously, as we know, is the co-founder of DNA itself. So I think he's a man who speaks with some authority. Basically, he has said we may have to turn our main research focus away from decoding the genetic instructions behind cancer and towards understanding the metabolism within the cancer cells. So I think there are there's a lot of evidence, a lot of, reputable researchers who contest this theory. The problem, with medicine and with science is people latch on to a particular theory, and it's very difficult for them to give that theory up. The Flat Earth Society or whatever else they believe it, especially when there's a lot of money involved, because chemotherapy is largely based on the somatic mutation theory and dealing with these mutant genes. The whole idea of chemotherapy is to target these dysfunctional chromosomes. And so that creates a big problem because it's the basic premise of chemotherapy. And chemotherapy, as we know, doesn't save lives, but it generates billions of dollars. And that's where the answer is.
Yeah, well, stay tuned. We'll definitely talk about those financial interests as we go through the discussion. This may be a naive question to ask, but is it possible that, given what you stated, that the genetic mutations themselves are a symptom rather than a cause? Is there any evidence to suggest that this is a function of cancer's development rather than its actual
Yes.
cause?
Yeah. So
Okay.
Thomas Seyfried, who's probably the world expert on the metabolic theory of cancer, believes that the changes in the genes occur secondary to the metabolic changes. You have profound metabolic dysfunction, profound cellular dysfunction, changes in enzymes, and that secondarily results in changes in the genetic makeup. But you know what? There is a bit of a two-way play. So there are some very few primary genetic mutations. So there's a cancer called CML, chronic myeloid leukemia, which is due to a genetic disease. So it's not an all one, and there is some overlap. And then obviously, as we know, certain people are genetically predisposed to develop cancer, the BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene. Now, the fact that you have the gene doesn't mean that you'll get cancer, and but it does increase your likelihood. And what's interesting is if you had the BRCA1 gene 40 years ago, your risk of getting cancer was about 40%. If you have the BRCA gene now, it's something like 75%. So there is an interaction between other environmental factors and genetic makeup. So genes, one's genetic makeup does have a role. So one's not saying that genes are completely out of the picture, but it seems that they play less of a role in the causation of cancer.
I mean, that would be common sense corner for me. I mean, that makes sense. And fascinatingly, I've been talking to I don't want to digress too far into different conditions, but a dear friend of mine suffers from a degenerative disease called Friedreich's ataxia. And he has a similar theory when it comes to the prevention and treatment of his, not prevention as such, but the treatment of his disease. He's very clear that genetics has played a role, but his based on his own research and his own pursuit of treatments, he believes that the metabolic theory around even degenerative diseases like Friedreich's ataxia could actually be a paradigm shift in our understanding of how we can treat a very different condition. But I want to bring it back to cancer and can I get a layperson's definition of what the metabolic theory is? So could you describe the metabolic theory in a kind of nutshell so we can get a grasp on what that means and how it differs from the genetic theory?
Yeah, so actually it was Otto Warburg in 1924, who first discovered that cancer cells metabolize differently. So, and this was a fundamental observation that he made, and he got the Nobel Prize. So that they use glucose instead of using it through the mitochondrion, which are the energy houses, and using oxygen, use glucose anaerobically, so that they don't use oxygen to ferment glucose. And so this is a mitochondrial disease. There's a defect in mitochondria. So mitochondria are the energy houses in the cell. So there's some dysfunction with the mitochondria. They cannot use glucose to generate energy using oxygen. So they anaerobically, although there's oxygen present, they cannot generate energy using glucose. And so this has been shown multiple times, and there's really good evidence that the defect in cancer is within the mitochondrion and not in the nucleus. So if you do transplants, cellular transplants, where you transplant the nucleus or you transplant the mitochondrion, the actual defect is in the mitochondrion, not in the nucleus. So if you put the nucleus of the cancer cell into a normal cell, it doesn't become malignant, doesn't get cancer. But if you do the opposite, you put the mitochondrion of a cancer cell into a normal cell, it becomes cancerous. So it appears that the defect in cancer is a problem with the mitochondrion. So the mitochondrion number is abnormal, their shape is abnormal, their function is abnormal. And for whatever reason, the mitochondria get damaged. And then that leads to the metabolic changes, which then lead to a whole host of things, which then can secondarily change the genetics. So the chromosomes can be then secondary impacted by the changes in the metabolism.
Okay, we're getting pretty deep into, well, this may, to someone who's familiar with all these terms, may not seem deep into the science, but I just want to make this accessible. So, in fact, just before I do this, again, I mentioned my friend's case in the Friedreich's ataxia. Interestingly enough, again, that is a mitochondrial defect that is at the core of that. And it does, my brain just suddenly goes to, okay, what is the mitochondrial dysfunction at the core of every major disease? That's where my brain goes. But before we go into that, could you define what the role of the mitochondria is? So that
Sure. So basically, a cell has a nucleus which contains the DNA and the chromosomes, and then it has the mitochondrion. And so the mitochondrion is that organelle which generates energy. It's the energy generating organelle. It makes what's called ATP. So the cellular energy that drives the cell is made by the mitochondria. And so if the mitochondria are defective, the cells don't work. So basically, this is a paradigm shift suggesting that the primary defect in cancer is not the nucleus, but the mitochondrion. So if you were to postulate this theory to most oncologists, they would laugh at you.
do vaccines cause cancer?
Yes.
This has got a direct link with the rollout of an experimental gene therapy.
Without question.
Turbo cancer.
More aggressive cancer, dying much quicker. The other thing they're seeing is patients who previously were in remission.
And why is that? I mean, to me, it makes sense.
It's just because the whole idea of cancer being a chromosomal disease is so embedded and ingrained in the culture and in the narrative that it would be preposterous. It would be, considered, comical to even suggest such a thing, that the defect is not in the nucleus.
Okay. Would they argue that the chromosomes are at fault for creating the mitochondrial damage or defect?
Yeah, so they would say it's the other way around, that people have got this completely wrong. But as I said, there are some very interesting experiments where they take the nucleus of a cancer cell. So if the cancer was in the nucleus and you put that nucleus into a normal cell, the nucleus of a cancer cell, you would imagine you would transfer the cancer to this new cell, and that doesn't happen. So I think there's really good data that the primary problem with cancer is not the nucleus, but it's the mitochondrion. So there's a problem with energy metabolism and biochemical pathways. That's probably the best way of saying it, that it's a metabolic disease. As Dr. Ziefried and many others have said, it's a metabolic disease rather than a somatic chromosomal disease.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So this is, what then do we know about what will create that mitochondrial defect or malfunction?
Yeah, so that's the big question. So it's,
I'm trying to solve it here.
if we had all the answers, I don't think we would be sitting here today. So I think, many of the factors associated with cancer that we think affect the nucleus probably affect the mitochondria and damage the mitochondria in some way. So, toxins, smoke, alcohol, metabolic diseases such as obesity and insulin resistance, vitamin D deficiency. So it's likely that multiple factors target mitochondrial function, probably oxidative damage to the mitochondria. So that rather than the damage being done to the DNA, primarily the damage is done to the mitochondrial and the mitochondrial membranes. So it's just a matter of refocusing, where the damage takes place. And obviously it has implications for treatment. Because if you want to treat it, whether it's a mitochondrial disease, a metabolic disease, or it's a chromosomal disease, the approach will be very different.
Does that explain then why chemotherapy is effective for some and not for others? I mean, as you were speaking, the ones that you outlined where chemo is effective, I was thinking, my thought was, is that because we can more accurately target the specific cells with more specificity when it comes to, say, testicular cancer? You're not trying to zap something inside the body, in the
Yeah,
lungs.
so chemo works better on liquid tumors rather than solid tumors. So these tend to be more homogeneous. They tend to be more rapidly dividing. So they have the characteristics that make them more suitable to respond to chemotherapy, as a general rule. So, the bottom line is there's still a lot of questions we just don't know. So it's not like we saying we have all the answers. I think, if we did, we'd be in a good place. I think what we do know is the risk of cancer is getting greater. More people are dying of cancer, and the current therapy is less than ideal. And so we need to look for newer approaches to the treatment of cancer. It's going to become a really important problem. 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women are going to get cancer. So this is something that people need to be aware of. And most importantly, there are things that one can do proactively to reduce one's risk of getting cancer.
Yes, I mean, I definitely want to hear about that, and I know our audience as well. But before we go into the discussion around what people can do, and we're going to talk about the role of repurposed drugs. Firstly, I'm curious to know what led you to shift your focus to cancer. The last few years, many of our audience will be familiar with the work that you would have done with the FLCCC, working alongside Dr. Pierre Corey, who's recently been on the show. Has this always been an interest of you? What caused the shift? Because you're now writing on this. It's an extensive focus of yours. What was there a defining moment that caused a kind of transition for you at this stage of your career?
So Dan, you ask a really good question. Many people ask me, they say, well, I'm a critical care doctor. I'm an internist. What right do I have to tell people how they should approach the treatment of cancer? So that is a good question. And
you have more right than I do.
So it was a sort of a merging of a number of facts. Firstly, with COVID, it opened up our eyes. We realized how that we've been misled, that most of medicine is a fraud, is based on deception, deceit, dishonesty. So most of the major medical therapeutics in medicine is based on dishonesty and manipulation of data. And you can look at statins, you can look at use of antidepressants, and you look at chemotherapy. It's all based on deception and dishonesty because it's just not supported by science. And so obviously COVID opened up our eyes to the dishonesty of big pharma and how they're really not interested in health outcomes, but in financial outcomes. And, obviously COVID opened up my eyes. And then, with COVID, we became very interested in repurposed drugs. And, repurposed drugs. So if people don't know what a repurposed drug is, which is really important. So a repurposed drug is a drug which is approved by the regulatory agencies, by your agency or the FDA, but for a different indication, but you're allowed to use it for another indication. It's perfectly legal. And up until COVID, 35 to 40% of drugs were used for off-label or repurposed use, and it was perfectly fine. You didn't need consent. You didn't have to get permission from the patient. It was standard of care. But then COVID came around, and there were certain drugs that threatened the vaccine, because in order to get the EUA for the vaccine, there had to be no effective alternative drug. And so ivermectin posed a threat. So they had to demonize ivermectin. So that's the short and tall of why repurposed drugs became banned. I mean, doctors, previously you could write a repurposed drug and nobody would mind. Now in many countries, the US, Canada, Australia, if you wrote a script for repurposed drugs, you could lose your license and be imprisoned. So that was a major change. So, we became interested in repurposed drugs. And then obviously I realized that there were many conditions for which repurposed drugs were very effective. And then it was just by coincidence that I saw an interview with Jane McClelland. So Jane McClelland is this British woman who wrote the book, How to Starve Cancer. She had cancer and she basically cured herself. And I heard the interview and she used mainly repurposed drugs, and the two just kind of clicked together, repurposed drugs, cancer. And I thought that's really interesting. And then as the story thickens, I mean, who would have thought that ivermectin would prove to be one of the most effective anti-cancer drugs? People demonized it as a horse dewormer. That's only role was to treat worms in horses, forgetting that it had been used in millions of people to treat parasitic diseases quite effectively, being very safe. It turns out that ivermectin is one of the most effective anti-cancer drugs. Truly astonishing. Who would have thought? So the circle went all the way around, and we're back to repurposed drugs, ivermectin, and cancer.
Wow. Well, I mean, there's so much here. But before we get into the ivermectin and repurposed drugs in cancer, because this is such a fascinating story in itself, I'm curious, before COVID came along, did you yourself have a view on the role of repurposed drugs? I mean, were you also someone who was critical of their use? Because clearly the world was divided on this quite significantly. The medical world, the scientific world, the media, the medical media. There was almost it was more than a reluctance. There was just an intolerance of the idea that repurposed drugs could play a role, which to me, even as a non-scientific individual, it baffles me that if you know the mechanism of how a drug works and how it interacts in the body in one indication, why wouldn't you make an assumption or hypothesis that if you apply that understanding of how the drug functions to another application, that it could be successful? I mean, that to me again seems like common sense corner. It's if we understand what this does in this context, is it possible that we apply it to a different context and it creates similar or even enhanced results to what we previously understood about its prior application? I mean, think about it as well. If you look through history, so many things that have been innovated or invented have become by accident because you tried it in a different context. And you're like, well, hang on a minute, this does amazing things that we didn't previously understand. But for you personally, what side of the fence were you on before COVID came along?
So I was more on the other side. I was a system doctor. I worked in the system. I believed the narratives. I believed that statins worked. I believed antidepressants worked. I believed, much of the BS that we were told. But also I had an inkling that everything wasn't right. I was one of the first people to use vitamin C for the treatment of sepsis. And, I was scolded and reprimanded for doing that. So I did have an open mind because, as you say, if you can show the mechanisms by which it works, if there's good scientific data that it can work, what's the problem? And so vitamin C is a good example. There was extensive data demonstrating the mechanisms of action, why vitamin C should be helpful in patients with sepsis. What you may not know is all species on this planet, when they're stressed, make vitamin C, except humans and guinea pigs. So we have a problem. When we stress, we can't make vitamin C, and we need vitamin C. And so there are many reasons why it makes sense. But because it's against mainstream, because it's cheap, because you can't put a patent on it. That's where the bottom line is. If you can't patent an agent, then according to the industry, that can't have a role. And the same really holds for vitamin D. Vitamin D is such an important hormone. If we had used vitamin D instead of some of the other nonsense we did in COVID, we would have changed the face of COVID. It's a very important hormone. And it's cheap. It's very cheap, and you can't put a patent on it. But it certainly could have saved millions of lives if it had been more widely used.
I mean, with all the insane money printing during COVID, the governments could have, just sent out doses of vitamin C to every citizen if they really cared. It would cost less than shutting down the economy for however long it was in the end.
Yeah. So just vitamin C and vitamin D, if they had just widely distributed, they would have had a major impact. And obviously at a fraction of the cost.
Yeah. So obviously the COVID chapter shifted your own perception of repurposed drugs. Just out of curiosity, was there a tipping point when it came to ivermectin specifically for you? Because, there was such a tide against the use of ivermectin in the kind of mainstream scientific. Was there a moment where you said, was there an aha moment where you said, well, I've seen enough, now?
Yeah, I think the FDA's propaganda machine, when that went into full steam, you're not a horse, you're not a cow, stop it. I think that was the tipping moment, because then the general public, they were very effective. So we will give it to them. They were very effective in their counter propaganda, because the general public, and still today, think that ivermectin is made for horses. Somehow it's a horse medication, and it's just used for deworming. So that was maybe a turning point. And then for me personally, we weren't allowed to prescribe ivermectin. It's quite absurd. I mean, we were practicing physicians. Ivermectin was a FDA-approved drug, and we were prohibited by the federal government and the agencies from prescribing a legal drug. It's completely absurd. So obviously there was severe shenanigans that went along to prevent us prescribing this drug. So, when we first started, when Pierre and myself started speaking about ivermectin, the sales went up exponentially. And obviously they were worried because they could see what was happening. So they had to start a counteroffensive, and they were very effective. The FDA went on their propaganda program. They sent letters to the Federation of State Medical Boards, threat that the state boards must threaten doctors who prescribe ivermectin. There's a doctor in Maine, Dr. Merrill Nass, who basically lost her license. I mean, because she was trying to help her patients with ivermectin hydroxychloroquine. And I mean, the absurdity is her patients were very grateful for what she did and were very thankful, yet the state medical board took away her license. So they went on an all-out campaign, and had nothing really to do with ivermectin. It had to do with getting the vaccines approved, the regulatory approval.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely evident. I mean, many of us saw it at the time, but looking back now, it's even more clear. What I want to understand now is well, interestingly, COVID became the big C for a while. We've always referred to cancer as the big C, but I mean, literally our focus, well, not our focus, but the focus of the world became so myopically obsessed with COVID that it became at the expense of the focus on any other major cause of disease or death. And COVID became the big C, and we overlooked the real big C of cancer for 4 years whilst everyone turned their attention to COVID. But as you turned your attention to cancer, the shenanigans that you referenced when it came to ivermectin with COVID, have you observed any of that type of behavior when it comes to cancer? Because
Of course. So, ivermectin has been vilified. So when, even some of my colleagues, when you tell them, ivermectin is very effective for the treatment of cancer, there, there are multiple scientific papers showing the metabolic pathways by which it works. And so just to tell you something interesting, we decided to do an exercise. We asked one of the AI machines, could you give us a list of those drugs that have the most mechanistic pathways against cancer cells? Do you know what number one was?
I really hope it was ivermectin.
It was ivermectin.
Yes.
So it was really interesting. So AI, theoretically, this was objective scientific data out there. Number one was ivermectin. Number two was curcumin. Number three was fenbendazole. Number four was mebendazole. So the drugs that we use. And they provided really good explanations with the metabolic pathways that are involved. The fascinating fact, what happened then, and this just tells you the world we live in, because people are watching what we're doing. We went back the next day and asked the exact same question, and it said we can't answer that question.
Madness.
And so then we asked, how do we know if AI has been censored? And AI itself said, if we don't give you an answer.
Wow.
So they admitted that they had been censored. So, the first day, nobody had really asked that question before. And so it gave us a true, honest answer, which we have. And there are multiple pathways by which ivermectin affects the metabolic pathways in the cancer cell. It's a very effective drug. But obviously it's cheap and people just don't want to admit it.
Well, we've talked about ivermectin. You also mentioned fenbendazole, which Mel Gibson has come into public criticism for his interview with Joe Rogan, where he said that he had 4 friends who had stage 4 cancers, and that 3 of them have gone into full remission because they used ivermectin and fenbendazole. Yeah. So is this what you're seeing in your own investigations when it comes to using repurposed drugs for cancer? Are you seeing efficacy with these particular combinations?
Yeah. So our list is dynamic and it changes. For medical reasons, we have to recommend mebendazole rather than fenbendazole. And the reason is fenbendazole is approved for animals only. So as a medical practitioner, patients can take it, but we can't advise that they take it. But essentially, mebendazole and fenbendazole are the same compound. So we actually, more recently think that the combination of ivermectin and mebendazole or fenbendazole is probably a very effective combination as first-off therapy for the treatment of cancer. And what makes it so appealing is it's across the board, across the range. Apart from probably brain tumors, just because ivermectin doesn't cross into the brain, mebendazole does. It seems to be a very effective combination against cancer. So, we would recommend it as number one, probably together with vitamin D. Vitamin D is very effective, very important for cancer. And then probably melatonin, something, as simple as melatonin. So there are, a whole host of over-the-counter medications as well as cheap prescription drugs that are very effective against cancer. We need to test them. What the data shows is these chemotherapy drugs are exceedingly expensive, can cost patients over $100,000 a year, and about 50 to 60% of patients with cancer get into financial problems and become insolvent because of the cost of their medication. I mean, it's outrageous because obviously, and what is the benefit of these drugs? The studies show, there's a study over 15 years, there's a study over 30 years, that chemotherapy prolongs life about 2 to 3 months. 2 to 3 months. That's the some benefit. For some cancers, such as gastric cancer, it actually reduces life expectancy. So, when I said this was a hoax and a scam, unfortunately, to a large extent, chemotherapy is a hoax. It's a hoax perpetuated by big pharma to make money at the expense of people who suffer.
I mean, there's been countless times when I thought to myself whether we'll look back in history and look back at chemotherapy and say that was the most harmful intervention. I mean, you could argue some of the things we've seen during COVID end up being the most harmful intervention, but that's just me being completely cynical now. But I do wonder if we'll look back at chemotherapy with 100 years time or even 10 years time and say, what were we doing? Because of that harm, and the cost benefit analysis around that is significantly skewed towards the cost side. My wife sadly lost her mother due to, I talked to Dr. Corey about this, due to a rare cancer called mesothelioma, which is caused by asbestos. And she was offered chemotherapy, and they said that at a maximum it would extend her life by 3 to 6 months. So, and her quality of life as a result would deteriorate significantly. So it was a no-brainer, no decision from her. And she approached the cancer with a combination of natural approaches, including things we'll talk about later on, eliminating glucose, certain sugars of certain types, and following a ketogenic diet, which I'd like to talk to you about as well. And she ended up an extensive vitamin C, and her supplement protocol was very expensive, but it extended her life to 6 years. And most people who have that particular cancer don't live that long. And she had a very good quality of life for that entire period.
So, I think what you say is true, is it's the quality of life. And so chemotherapy makes these people miserable. They become it wipes out their marrow. They get infections. They get sore mouths. Their gut gets disturbed. It makes them miserable. And chemotherapy does really bad things. You need your immune system. Almost all of the repurposed drugs that we use work to improve the immune system, to help the immune system, the T cells, fight the cancer. Chemotherapy does the opposite. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It wipes out the immune cells which destroy the cancer. That just is so counterintuitive. It just doesn't make sense, because you need the immune cells to attack the cancer. The other thing that it does, chemotherapy has been shown to help cancer spread. It causes metastases. It helps cancer cells spread. It also activates cancer stem cells. So chemotherapy seems to do the worst things possible that you would want.
I mean, it must be such a difficult decision for people who are faced with that awkward moment of facing that diagnosis, and their oncologist, the first thing they talk about is chemotherapy, because it's, again, the widespread understanding that this is a genetic disease, the widespread understanding that chemotherapy is the dominant approach for many of these different cancers. But they also simultaneously know the risks that come with it to a degree. Yet they're not actually given any alternatives. For my wife's mother, for instance, had to go on her own voyage of discovery, and it was only by an absolute, coincidence, act of God, that she ended up meeting someone who was pioneering a vitamin C protocol that was bearing really strong results, and he happened to be in her choir in Cornwall, of all places in the world, on the deepest southwest coast of England. And that played a significant role. But without that, her doctor would have never given blessing for that. Her doctor would never have brought it to her. And she had to go to great lengths to even insist that she could have scans to show that it was working. And
yes, so I mean, you're absolutely right. This is the tragedy, is that the system doctors are so indoctrinated, they so brainwashed, they so controlled that they offer only one form of therapy. They won't even consider any alternative. So patients don't have any alternatives. That's why it's really, really, really important that patients, listen to podcasts like this, and patients read. There are books out there. There is information so that at least they can inform themselves. Patients, the days where the doctor was all powerful and told the patient what to do is done. It's gone. Patients need to empower themselves so that they take control, because it should be a partnership between the patient and the doctor. It shouldn't be a dictatorial, relationship where the doctor dictates what's done and then that's what's done. It should be a consensual. The patient should give consent. The patient should understand, and it should be a partnership. And unless that relationship holds, the patient needs to find another doctor.
Yeah, thoroughly agree. What would you say? I mean, I can already hear it now. We saw it during COVID, and I've been exposed to this countless times. We've done over 1,000 episodes of the Pandemic podcast prior to relaunching as the Astin-Gregory podcast. My guest smeared as spreading information. What would you say to the people who are saying that, Dr. Paul Marik is spreading misinformation on the Astin-Gregory podcast today? What would your rebuttal be, given what we've discussed so far? A quick break for a word from one of our partners. In times of economic uncertainty, gold has always been used as a safe haven for wealth. It's a tangible asset that has historically held its value, even when markets were volatile. And now more than ever, it's crucial to have physical assets that can protect your wealth. That's why we've partnered with the Pure Gold Company. They offer a secure, reliable way to buy physical gold bullion and precious metals, whether you're looking to diversify your portfolio, hedge against inflation, or simply protect your savings. With fully insured gold products stored in world-class private vaults, you can rest assured that your physical gold is safe and secure. For bullion-grade gold bars and coins, the Pure Gold Company makes it easy to purchase physical gold that you can actually hold. If you're ready to take action and safeguard your wealth, then visit danastingregory.com/gold to download your free guide and take advantage of a free consultation to explore your gold bullion options. Now, let's get back to the show.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, that's what I've been accused of. The American Board of Internal Medicine took away my board certification because they accused me of being a misinformationist. So people have to have an open mind. They wouldn't have gone after myself and Pierre Corey and Peter McCullough so viciously if there wasn't something they were scared of. So people need to open their minds and look a little bit further, because there are some very sinister forces at play, and figure out for yourself who's telling the truth. Because we know, and it's a terrible thing to say, that the government has lied. We just have to look at some of the things that they've said. We know that, they said this thing came from the wet market. We know that that's a lie. This came from the lab in Wuhan. We said they told us masks worked. We know masks don't work. They told us the 6-foot rule. We know that was nonsense. They told us about lockdowns. So, people just need to be a little bit more open-minded and see that a lot of what they were told was not true. And so they have to question everything they were told because it may not have been true.
Yeah, I'm questioning everything was the subtitle of my pandemic podcast during the course of COVID, and continued to question everything as I keep going on this journey. I want to come back to the repurposed drugs now. I think this is a really important part of the discussion. And there's a couple of things I'm really curious about, because firstly, I know you've reviewed over 250 repurposed drugs for potential cancer treatment, and you've now got a short list in your book that you get down to 18. But before we talk about those drugs and why and how they work and what people can look at, how does this exploration of repurposed drugs connect with the thesis that cancer is a metabolic disease? Does that help us understand why some of these repurposed drugs have an efficacy based upon that alternative explanation of what causes
Exactly.
cancer?
So almost all of these drugs work on multiple metabolic pathways. So they act on metabolic and enzyme pathways within the cell. So I think it fits very well. And so what's unique about almost all of these drugs is, unlike cancer, traditional oncology drugs, which act, by one mechanism, almost all of these drugs, and you can look at ivermectin, acts by about 15 or 20 different pathways to interfere with metabolic pathways in the cell. And so that fits much better with the metabolic theory than with this chromosomal somatic theory. So almost all of these drugs act on a whole host of different metabolic pathways.
You've looked at over 250 of these drugs. So how did you then whittle that list down? What was your criteria to kind of bring it down to a concrete list of high potential repurposed drugs?
So that's the difficult part, and it's a dynamic process that's changing all the time, and we keep on moving drugs up and down. But initially, we wanted to be sure that there was good clinical data, so that it's all very well that a drug works in a test tube or a petri dish or an animal model, but we wanted some data that it worked in humans. And obviously that was difficult because there are not going to be large studies that are funded to test these drugs, but we at least wanted some data in humans. At the beginning, I was a little bit stricter. Now, people talk about anecdotes. So, an anecdote is an anecdote, but once you hear an anecdote 100 times, then it becomes a much more powerful factor. So, I say that particularly because of the ivermectin, mebendazole, fenbendazole combination, is that I can't tell you how many people we've heard from who've had outstanding results with that combination. Now, while there are a few published reports, it's not as extensive as we would have liked, but I think we have enough clinical data. The other thing is both drugs have a very good safety record. So they have been used for other indications. So we know that they're safe. And that's really important. Many of these drugs are used in the test tube with no human safety data. And obviously the first dictum in medicine is first do no harm. So we wanted to make sure that these drugs were safe. And we know without any question of doubt that, ivermectin, although it's been vilified and demonized, is a very safe drug. Because it's been used in millions of patients.
And is there any published research on ivermectin and cancer in humans, or is this,
Yes, there is a little bit. There are about 4 or 5 case reports, unfortunately. So there's not a lot of, there's quite a lot of in vitro data in test tubes and in animal models. In terms of patients, it's a handful of case reports, unfortunately, but, we're hoping that will change. Obviously, it's, the whole medical system the whole medical system is biased against repurposed drugs. The medical journals are controlled by big pharma. Medical schools are controlled by big pharma. So it's very difficult to get papers published that challenge the status quo. They just will not be accepted. But I think it will happen. We're currently doing a study looking at ivermectin in cancer. Hopefully, we'll be able to get it published, and we're having encouraging results. So,
I mean, if we were living in it feels like we're living in a parallel universe, Dr. Marik, because it, if we lived in a sane world, we would look back at what happened during COVID and think, wow, we've got these repurposed drugs that have created enormous, they've saved lives, they've reduced symptoms, et cetera, et cetera. Why aren't we looking at why we should, how else we can apply these drugs to other contexts that offer similar application for what we understand about the different pathways and their interaction in the human body? Instead, we've got the absolute opposite. We've got this double down resistance against these things for the reasons you cited. And we will talk about, as we close later on, how we can tackle that, because frankly, that is a huge barrier. And that concerns me as a concerned citizen, knowing that if I ever come into a situation where I need to, or for myself or my family, my loved ones, seek out the greatest possible treatments for things like cancer, hopefully go through life avoiding that. But if I can't, then I want to be able to try these things with whatever evidence is available. So how do we navigate around this? Because you preempted one of my questions. Why is there such a lack of large scale clinical trials for repurposed drugs? And is it simply conflicts of interest? Is that your view? Is that what you think is blocking?
It's because big pharma and the pharmaco-industrial complex do not want it to happen. Particularly oncology. Oncology is a 200 to 400 to 600 billion dollar industry, and they will do whatever they can to protect their investment. So this has got nothing to do with the health and well-being of human beings, and it's an outright tragedy. And that's why, hopefully this new administration will be able to, the new administration in the US can change this somewhat because of these terrible conflicts of interest. There's no question big pharma are corrupt, they're immoral, they're illegal, they're not interested in health, they're interested in making money at the expense of people's health. And so this has to change. And I think us, the people, need to voice our objection. And hopefully we can see some change. See more use of repurposed drugs. Hopefully it can be more accepted. We can see more studies. And because if you think about it, cancer is a disease of the whole world. It's not like it's limited to first world countries. And these very expensive drugs just can't be afforded in, third world countries. Whereas, ivermectin, the WHO used to sell a 6 milligram tablet of ivermectin for 2 cents. That's how cheap it used to be. So these drugs are very cheap and have a potential to have an enormous impact across the world. But obviously, that's not the goal of big pharma and the pharmaco-industrial complex. And unfortunately, people have to wake up and realize how evil this system is, and that things must change. If we're, interested in the betterment of humanity, we need to change the status quo.
I'm right with you on that. Dr. Marik, from all the drugs you've looked at, obviously I understand that there's limitations in terms of the clinical trials that are available, and hopefully that will change over time with people like yourself pioneering in this area now. But from all the evidence you've looked at, what would you say are the top 5 repurposed drugs that are showing most potential or promise when it comes
to... that seems to be changing a little bit. So as I said, I think vitamin D is very important. Everyone should take vitamin D and should take high levels of vitamin D. And it's very cheap. It will cost you $100 for a whole year. And then I would say ivermectin, mebendazole, melatonin, green tea. Um, uh, those would be, oh, and doxycycline. Recently, we found that the combination of doxycycline, and it's a low dose, 50 milligrams a day, together with vitamin C, is very effective in killing cancer stem cells and cancer cells. So this is, doxycycline used to be somewhat lower on our list. We found some really interesting research. So the list is changing. Um, we think that would be in our, top list.
Wow, wow.
And
And
then, you could add drugs like metformin. Metformin is a prescription drug. It's very cheap. So, we're not talking about expensive drugs. We're talking about, things over the counter or otherwise prescription. And the other one is curcumin. So curcumin actually came second to ivermectin in the number of metabolic pathways that it affected. And obviously, it's a supplement you can get over the counter in the US. So that would be like our top 6 or 7 drugs we would suggest. Now, I think with time, this will probably change because it's very dynamic. But, we've become quite impressed with a combination of mebendazole, fenbendazole, and ivermectin.
Again, during COVID, a lot of the doctors that I spent time with were kind of debating the kind of merits of combinations of drugs and the synergistic effects, and trying to calculate, specific doses in certain formulations and certain combinations that would have the most optimal outcomes. Is that the case with cancer too? It's the case of trying to find.
Yeah, so some people use 1 or 2 drugs. We think you need a combination of drugs, at least 4 or 5. So there was a study. So there aren't many published studies, but there was a study called the Marik study, which was published by Care Oncology in London. And so what they did is they looked at patients with glioblastoma. So it's a tumor of the brain, and they used 4 drugs. So they used mebendazole, they used metformin, they used atorvastatin, and they used doxycycline, 4 drugs. And basically, they compared those 4 drugs to standard of care. So patients got standard of care or standard of care plus those 4 drugs. And they showed that it doubled survival using that combination of drugs. So I think it does create a precedent that, drug combinations that make sense can actually impact patient survival.
That's incredible. Yeah, you've mentioned obviously within that mix, vitamin D, curcumin. So I want to transition to talk about the non-drug cancer interventions. So, what else should we be considering? Things like vitamin C? Are there other things that are showing potential outside of the kind of pharmaceutical, even repurposed
So
drugs?
obviously diet is really important. As I said, because of the metabolic changes that happen in the cancer cell becomes highly dependent on glucose. It feeds on glucose. So basically, you need to take a diet which is low in glucose, which makes sense because we know that, a highly refined diet, highly processed food, sugar, is really bad for metabolic syndrome, but it also drives the cancer cell. There's really good data, published data that patients who eat a diet which is high in glucose and high in insulin, they have a much higher risk of having recurrent tumors. So diet is really important. You really want to take a low glycemic diet. So that's a diet low in sugars. And ideally, you would want to take a ketogenic-like kind of a diet because ketones themselves have many beneficial effects in patients with cancer. So as close to a ketogenic diet as possible, and very important to reduce refined sugars. It's very important.
Are all sugars treated equal in that regard? I mean, glycemic load you've mentioned, but are we just talking about added sugar in products, or because people are naturally going to think, well, surely fruit and vegetables are good for my health? How do you distinguish between
Yeah,
something?
so it's not the glycemic index. I mean, vegetables are fine. You want to avoid fruits that are very high in sugar because they will cause your glycemic index to go up. So, I mean, it's quite simple. You can just Google glycemic index and it will give you a list of foods that have a very high glycemic index. So obviously, sugar, sugary drinks, sweetened drinks, juices. Juices are really bad because they have a high glycemic index. Certain fruits have a high glycemic index. Almost all vegetables are fine. So, cheese is fine, eggs are fine, meat is fine. Some fruits have a high glycemic index. So diet does become almost as important as repurposed drugs, because as we said, the repurposed drugs are acting on the metabolic pathways. It defeats the purpose if you're feeding these cells a high glucose load. Very important. So it's very important to reduce the amount of refined sugar you take in the diet.
Yes, I mean, interesting enough, again, going back to my wife's mother, she followed a raw food diet because some of the actually the cooking mechanisms are known to be carcinogenic. So she eliminated some of those from her protocol, but then she followed largely a ketogenic diet. So obviously, I'm very familiar with the ketogenic diet as a result of witnessing her protocols. But for those who aren't familiar, could you explain what that means in practice and specifically how that impacts on the cancer pathway?
Yeah, so a ketogenic diet basically, is a diet higher in fats. So for whatever reason, the food industry has demonized saturated fats and cholesterol. That's another farce. That's another lie. It's another scam. Saturated fats and cholesterol are absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. They're healthy. What's unhealthy are seed oils and vegetable oils. So basically what you want to do is take a diet which is low in sugar and higher in fat. Eggs are fine, meat is fine, cheese is fine, seeds are fine. So it's a ketogenic diet. You can, Google it quite easily. You can be as strict as you want to be, but basically you want to increase your intake of fats, saturated fats, omega-3 fatty acids, decrease omega-6 fatty acids, take in eggs, take in cheese, take in full cream. Coffee and cream is really good if you like coffee. Avoid sugary drinks. And so the idea is when you don't take in sugar, the body makes bodies called ketone bodies as a source of fuel. The body uses ketone bodies as a source of fuel. The brain uses ketone bodies. It so happens that ketone bodies have very beneficial effects in terms of cancer and cancer cell metabolism. So keto bodies are really good to control cancer.
What's the relationship between glucose and high sugar diets and the mitochondrial function? Is this potentially an indicator of low mitochondrial health and therefore a trigger
Yeah,
for
so
cancer?
basically these are dysfunctional mitochondria. So the problem in cancer is the mitochondria are dysfunctional. They cannot use ketone bodies. They can only use glucose, and they use glucose inefficiently. This is the primary problem with the mitochondria in cancer, is that the mitochondria, they can't use oxygen to make energy. They use glucose very inefficiently. And glucose becomes the only fuel that the mitochondrion can use. It can't use fatty acids, and it can't use ketone bodies. That's why, Jane McLennan says, starve the cancer cells by not giving them glucose.
So sugar literally feeds cancer.
Yes, so the sugar actually feeds the cancer. So the worst thing you could do is take a high glycemic load diet.
Well, so I mean, there's on the surface, a lot of these things sound simple, and in your book, you cite that 42% of cancers are preventable. In many ways, that sort of feels like seeking out all these cures could be a red herring because there are things we can do further upstream that could actually eliminate the possibility of developing cancer particularly based on an understanding of metabolic theory and how that impacts on cancer development, because there's so many things under our control that can influence our longevity and health. But understandably, not only is it difficult for people to find this type of information that we're talking about today, so that they can actually get that baseline understanding of their role that their diet plays and their lifestyle plays in the potential causation and formation of cancer and development of cancer, but then specifically finding the solutions, like some of the things we talked about today. But similarly, we also face very complex lifestyles. So, the idea of cutting back on certain food types, or, managing your sleep more effectively, etc., for a lot of people under these high pressure, uncertain world that we live in, is difficult. So where would you say is most important for people to start? What's the recommended starting point for people to start to improve the quality of their lives so they can actually help to ward off cancers?
Yeah, so you raise a good question, because you have to live in the real world and you have to function in the real world. And so some of these things are just very difficult to achieve. So you may not reach all the objectives you want, but you can change to some degree. And so I think the first would be diet. I think without question is to decrease the intake of highly processed, ultra processed food. If it looks like food, it's food, and eat it. If it comes in a box and a wrapper, try and avoid eating it. So try and eat more real food than processed food. Sleep is important, although people don't think so. You need to get at least, adult 7 to 8 hours of sleep, good quality sleep. You need some exercise. And so those are the beginning starting points. And, if you just do a few of those slowly, you can change your lifestyle, because there's no question of doubt that most of the chronic diseases we suffer from are lifestyle, and insulin resistance, which relates to a diet high in processed food. And as it suggests, insulin resistance underlines diabetes, metabolic syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, heart disease. So most of the chronic diseases of Western man are related to insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is caused by diets high in processed food. Much of the food we eat is empty calories. It's just sugar and carbohydrates. We need to eat much higher quality food.
What I want to close with is asking, where can patients go to access, some of the evidence around what we've been discussing today? How can they keep track of your work? Because, as you've stated, even since you began this work, that almost the league table of effectiveness is changing understandably. You wouldn't expect the science to be settled in in just a few years of work.
The good news is my book is available on Amazon.com. It's called Cancer Care. It's pretty cheap. It's $12. So the interesting story is Amazon banned my book because it was taken down, and I was banned lifelong because I was told that I was disseminating incorrect and misleading information, and I was doing a disservice to the public.
By Amazon?
By Amazon. I was banned by Amazon.
The ultimate arbiters of medical truth.
Yes. And then there seems to have been an outcry. And I'm not sure exactly where it came from. I mean, I objected because I said, well, if I'm providing misleading information, please point out where it is. And so I think there was quite a response. So my book was unbanned. So in a way, that's a mark of certification, a mark of excellence, because it was banned because it was so bad, but then because it was so good, it was put back again. So the book is available on Amazon.com. It's $12 US. It's the second edition, so it's almost close to where I would want it now. The only exception would be, fenbendazole, mebendazole, ivermectin would be slightly higher, and doxycycline would be higher, but the general principles still hold true.
Incredible. My closing question for you: we've been able to poke some fun at some of the issues that we've seen in the world in the last few years. And I think it's important to do that, as well as take it very seriously in terms of how we can create systemic change. But cancer itself is a serious issue. So my final question to you is, what is your message to people who are currently dealing with cancer right now, whether that's cancer patients or their loved ones who are supporting people through cancer? What's your closing message to people who are fighting cancer right now?
I think the message is there's hope, that there's always something you can do. Don't give up hope, and look for alternative therapies, some things that are quite simple that can help. And, avoid, just use your common sense. If chemotherapy sounds too toxic, you don't have to accept it. There are alternatives. There are more natural approaches. So I think use your common sense. And, the days where doctors were all powerful and all dictatorial, those days must be gone. You need to have a relationship with your doctor and have a discussion. And I think there are things that you can do that, I think quality of life is important. I think one needs to focus on the quality of life and try and avoid all the toxicity of some of these terrible drugs.
Dr. Marik, thank you so much for your courage, your insight, your conviction, and your commitment to challenging the status quo. Dr. Pierre Corey was on the show recently, spoke incredibly highly of you, and he sees you as his mentor and someone he's learning from greatly. And if you haven't yet seen that episode, everyone at home, Dr. Pierre Corey walks through the disinformation playbook that Big Pharma used to suppress some of the evidence around the likes of ivermectin. So do make sure you check that one out. All the things we've talked about today, all the links that Dr. Marik has shared will be in the description below this, so please do check that out. And if you'd like to get closer to the conversation and be part of a community of free thinkers, then you can join our Live Free and Prosper community at danastingregory.com/supporter. Now, we know that Big C is on the rise, so please do help us get this information out there. I encourage you to share this episode far and wide. Let's make sure we can challenge the dogmas that are out there and actually find a pathway to more effective, more natural approaches to not only cancer care, but our overall being. So thanks again, Dr. Marik. What a powerful conversation. And thank you for all the great work you're doing out there.
Thanks, Dan. It's been a pleasure.
Do vaccines cause cancer?
Yes.
This has got a direct link with the rollout of an experimental gene therapy.
Without question.
Turbo cancer.
More aggressive cancer, dying much quicker. The other thing they're seeing is patients who previously were in remission.